If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like, as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. Ron DeSantis has been saying over and over that he's going to leave woke in the ash heap of history. But given his plummeting poll numbers and his crumbling campaign, the only one getting left in the ash heap is DeSantis. And because he has no charisma, no charm, no character, and no ideas, he's powerless to change himself into a candidate who's more likable or electable. He's realizing, though is too pig-headed to admit it, that the GOP has created an artificial reality for itself in Florida, with all of their hyper-gerrymandering. They've manufactured a political bubble for themselves. But a bubble doesn't reflect the real world, and a bubble won't get you to the White House either. So what does he do? All the same things that haven't worked, only more of it. The failing governor of Florida has been doing his latest racist agitprop, this time pushing lies that slaves benefited from the alleged skills they supposedly learned while they were imprisoned. He's too stupid to realize this kind of crap may delight his fellow racists, but it repulses absolutely everyone else. First of all, slavery was not a jobs course. It was institutionalized savagery. Secondly, almost no slave ever left the plantation alive, so they never got to do anything later in life. Once on the plantation, your life was over. It wasn't like indentured servitude for white people where after so many years you were free to go. Slavery was lifelong, and it went on for 250 years. Thirdly, the only place that any slave ever used their so-called skills was strictly for the benefit of the white people who enslaved them. They never got to use their so-called skills for their own benefit, hence they never benefited from any of these alleged skills that slavery taught them. As DeSantis' latest attempt at being a hero to the white extremists blows up in his face, he's been put on the defensive again, except even he doesn't dare defend this. He lied and claimed that he didn't come up with this curricula, that he wasn't even sure what was in it. That, of course, is a lie. Florida's education department is not elected. They are chosen by the governor, who in this case is DeSantis. He chose them, he vetted them, he endorsed them, and he put them on the state's education board. But now that he's on the hot seat, he's acting like he doesn't know who they are, what they're doing, or what this is all about. If that's the case, then why did he also declare that the slavery propaganda in the curricula is factual? How can he know nothing about it, yet declare that it's factual? Both of those statements cannot be true. How can he know that these lies are facts when he admits that he hasn't actually looked at it? Florida's education board is nothing more than a DeSantis rubber stamp, carrying out the racist policies that he spent years advocating from at the governor's mansion. DeSantis also lied again, claiming that nobody said slavery was a good thing, and then in the very next breath he said, "We are teaching the honest history, good, bad, and ugly." Okay, so what part of slavery is the good part? He knows what he's saying are lies. That's the entire point. Of course, speaking of rubber stamps, DeSantis needs to give himself some cover, so he decided that before his education board would give the thumbs up to his rewriting of slavery, first they would need to get some black people to hide behind, to give themselves rhetorical cover. So DeSantis gathered a group of black career GOP operatives who have depended on the GOP for every crumb of their daily bread their entire lives. They would be the chosen bootlicks to sign off on these false claims that slavery benefited black people. These are the fringe of black society. They're the cowardly outcasts who nobody wants. And when you look at who these black members of this African American Studies group is, you see that they're all a bunch of corrupt liars with no real academic qualifications. They were chosen solely to be the black frontmen for a blatantly racist stunt. They are lifelong bootlicks who made careers out of being the Republican Party's black friend. One of these black rubber stamps who DeSantis was trying to hide behind is William B. Allen. Now, there's two things that you need to know about this guy. First, he's a tether. He admitted it himself. When Kamala Harris went to Florida and gave her tepid, weak criticism of this racist curricula, Fox News had this Allen character on, and he began splaining that his great-grandfather came to the U.S. from the islands. So this guy is a tether. There's not even a debate about it. He admits it himself. Secondly, this guy is also a lifelong Republican stooge. His career of kissing Republican behinds goes all the way back to the Reagan administration, at least. I know that a lot of you listening to me weren't even born when this guy started kissing the GOP's rump. Reagan put this guy on his so-called Commission on Civil Rights, and he's been carrying water for the white right ever since. This Allen character also fought to ban affirmative action in Michigan, though mostly what this guy does is run around giving talks to conservative groups, which means he's the only black person in the room talking to a bunch of racist white people about how they're not racist because he says so. Naturally, he's employed by far right-wing think tanks like the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions, among others. When you look at William Allen's so-called resume, it's basically a bootlick's greatest hits. Now, the thing that interested me most about him was his so-called education. Remember, this guy was put on a so-called history work group. But when you look at his resume, you find that he has no history background at all. He has a PhD, but it's in government, not history. And as for his background in teaching, he taught political science, not history. He's not a historian, he's never taught history, and it's dubious whether he's even bothered to read a history book. He has no qualifications whatsoever to be talking about, much less setting a history curriculum. But as we already know, he wasn't chosen because he was qualified. He was chosen because Desantis needed a front Negro who was politically reliable. His sole qualification is that he's one of the few black people who would actually lower themselves to tell DeSantis' lies. And notice how these Republicans had to get an old, decrepit, damn near dead, wrinkled-up loser like this to sell the soap for them. Another meat puppet for this so-called study group is a woman named Frances Presley Rice. She was in the military, though mostly she's known for doing over-the-top attention-whoring stunts to impress her racist right-wing masters. She put up a billboard saying that Dr. King was a Republican, with no evidence, mind you. She also was publishing a so-called magazine called The Black Republican, and the magazine was funded in part by money from the Republican Party itself. So this woman was finessing money from the GOP to put out this trash. This is how these bootlicks live. The GOP paid her to publish things like Democrats embrace their child molesters. I guess nobody ever spoke to her about people like Mark Foley and Dennis Hastert. She also said if the Democrats had left us, talking about black people, alone after the Republicans freed us from slavery, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. So clearly she's performing for a white audience. She's like Jesse Lee Peterson. She most likely doesn't even believe the stuff she says, but they're giving her money to say it, and she doesn't have any other skills, so this is what she's got to go with. She's so obnoxious that even the state Republican Party down there in Florida had to distance themselves from her and her performative extremism. They actually had to stop giving her money, and they even were forced to declare that in the future they were going to have to vet people more closely. Well, that's what the Florida State GOP was saying in 2008. But 15 years later, they're singing a completely different tune. Oh, and as for this Rice woman's education, she has a law degree and an MBA. She also spent 20 years in the military. So this woman has no historical background or qualifications whatsoever. She's not a historian. She's never taught history, and probably never read a history book either. This is who DeSantis and the Florida GOP are calling their history experts, and these scholars who they say did all of this fact-based research. Now, this Rice woman is clearly a whack job. No wonder they haven't had her doing any interviews. But it's this William Allen guy who's supposed to be their big gun, the eminently qualified expert, who was going to prove all of this stuff they were saying was facts. And speaking of people who didn't bother to read history, Florida's Department of Education was feeling the heat, and they put out a statement from William Allen and Frances Presley themselves. In this statement, these two listed the black people who were supposed to prove their point of slaves who learned skills during slavery and later in life put it to use for their own benefit. They named people like Ned Cobb, Henry Blair, Lewis Latimer, John Henry, James Fortin, Paul Cuffey, Betty Washington Lewis, John Chavis, and William Whipper, among others. Only one small problem with this list of 16 black slaves who learned valuable skills during slavery that benefited them later in life. Practically all the information that they listed isn't true. Ned Cobb was born in 1885, 20 years after the end of the Civil War. How could he have been a slave, much less learned any skills during his time as a slave when he was born a generation after slavery was over? That's not how time works. Also, Allen and Rice claimed that Ned Cobb was a blacksmith. That's not true either. Ned Cobb was a tenant farmer and a union activist. Henry Blair is another one who Allen and Rice falsely claimed was a slave who later in life became a blacksmith. In reality, Henry Blair was born a freeman, and he even held a number of patents which under U.S. law no slave could do. By the way, Henry Blair's patents had nothing to do with blacksmithing, just for the historical record. They claimed that Lewis Latimer was a slave and a blacksmith. That wasn't true. He wasn't a slave either. In fact, his parents fled north to escape slavery, and they gave birth to him as a freeman in Massachusetts. Lewis Latimer also held a number of patents too. Never a slave, and he got no skills from slavery either, obviously. Then they listed John Henry. For the record, John Henry is largely a figure of folklore, like Paul Bunyan. But since he's mostly folklore, he can't have ever been a slave, and he was supposed to have worked on a railroad, not as a blacksmith anyway. So even if he did exist, they would have gotten the occupation wrong. So why did they list him? Don't know, and I'll bet they don't know either. James Forten was another slave who learned valuable skills that helped him later in life. Except the problem was he was never a slave. He was born free in Pennsylvania. They list him as a shoemaker, which is only partly true. He was a shoemaker briefly, but he made his money and spent most of his life as a sailmaker. That's how he made his money. Again, James Forten was never a slave. And last time I checked, there were no slaves who were being taught to make sails for sailing ships either. Then there was Paul Cuffey, who Allen and Rice said was a slave, and he learned shoemaking while on the plantation. Of course, both of those are lies. Cuffey was born a freeman in Massachusetts, so he was never a slave, and he never made shoes either. Like James Forten, Cuffey was also involved in the maritime industry, only with Paul Cuffey he was a sea captain and a merchant. Again, he was never a slave and never a shoemaker either, despite what the two Florida GOP experts said. Another listing that the Florida Department of Education put out on behalf of Allen and Rice was slaves who learned fishing and shipping while they were enslaved. Again, how many plantations allowed their slaves to sail around or to fish? What part of picking cotton involves fishing? I'm just asking for a friend. One of the examples they listed of a slave who learned fishing and shipping while on the plantation was John Chavis, who was born free. He also fought in the Revolutionary War and became the first black person to attend college in the United States. He wasn't in shipping or fishing either for his occupation. He was a Presbyterian minister and later a teacher who taught Latin and Greek out of his home. Again, Florida's Department of Education falsely claims that Chavis was a slave and that he learned beneficial skills during slavery when he was never a slave and everything he learned was in a classroom, not a plantation. Another one they listed was William Whipper. He was born free in Pennsylvania, but I think you get the point. The Florida GOP's so-called experts, they try to defend themselves from the claims that they're teaching lies about slavery by giving a list of slaves, most of whom were never enslaved to begin with, and virtually none of them learned any skills while enslaved that they would use later in life. Oh, and there's one more person on this list that Allen and Rice put out that I would be remiss if I didn't mention them. Betty Washington Lewis. Not only was she never a slave, not only was she never a shoemaker as they falsely listed her as being, she wasn't even black. Betty Washington Lewis was George Washington's sister. She was a white woman. But they put her on the same list as black people who had been enslaved. There was absolutely no fact-checking done by this study group whatsoever. This gives you an idea of the class and caliber of individuals who signed off on this slavery was beneficial nonsense. See, this is what you would expect in a state where the governor bans history books. This just goes to show that these people weren't given the job at these right-wing think tanks or given any GOP money because they're smart. They were given patronage jobs because they're the only sorry Negroes willing to regurgitate the Republican Party's lies. This is what happens when you make a career out of being a meat puppet for the white right. When you spend decades just mindlessly repeating their lies and trying to impress them with how loosely you can play with the truth. Until you get to the point where you're just pushing outright lies. But who cares? This is what the paymasters on the white right want, so they do it. Practically all the black people that Allen and Rice listed were autodidacts. That means that they taught themselves, or at the very least, they found gainful employment as freemen, or they went to school, or as escaped slaves and learned a trade, but they didn't learn anything on the plantation. Now, being the white right, they pulled their usual stunt, which is in order to repeat this lie themselves, they first have to have their cherry-picked black sock puppets say it first. It's the same thing the white left does when there's something they want to say to attack black people. And the GOP is still trotting out the same handful of sellouts that they were putting out here 40 years ago. That shouldn't surprise you. By the 1980s, the Republican Party realized that the winds of change were still blowing, and having trotted out nothing but lily-white faces in their camp wasn't helping them. So they began to recruit some black faces to be part of their gang, at least for the purposes of photo ops. So they had people out front like Colin Powell, Clarence Thomas, Robert Bork, Thomas Sowell, and freaks like this William Allen clown who they had stand around and say, "These Republicans aren't racist, they put me on the payroll." And like any good bootlick, they did Massa's dirty work for them. Clarence Thomas was himself a product of, and at that point still a bold proponent of affirmative action in the early 80s, right up until people like Harlan Crow and his ilk told Thomas that being a bootlick would pay better. And he did a 180 so fast to make your head spin. Do you think that Clarence Thomas went from being a proponent of affirmative action to a right-wing poster boy so fast because the GOP thought that he was so qualified? They don't think chumps like Clarence Thomas are qualified for anything, because when it comes time to talk about the law, none of them calls on Clarence Thomas. When these white conservatives want to talk about things that matter, when it comes time for them to determine what they need to do for their power, and they need someone with expertise to inform their decisions, they call on people like that Michael Ludick guy who said that Vice President Pence didn't have the authority to refuse to validate the 2020 votes. They didn't call on Clarence Thomas for advice because he's an idiot. He's a sock puppet. He just repeats whatever they tell him, and they know it. When it comes time to talk about money, these white racist conservatives don't call on Thomas Sowell, who they say is supposed to be an economist. But you have never heard of any white right-wing or white media outlet period call on Thomas Sowell when the 1989 economic crash happened, or the economic boom of the 90s, or the tech bubble, or the first crash of the early aughts when Sunbeam, Tyco, Adelphia, and Enron went under, or the big crash a few years later in 2008 when the housing market bubble burst, or any other economic event. You want to know what a white man truly believes? Ask him about his money. Then you'll find out what he truly believes and who he actually trusts. And when it comes to these white conservatives' money, they don't trust Thomas Sowell. They don't even waste their time talking to him. Not when it's something that matters. His alleged economics degree is just a feeble way of giving him a credential. It's just their cheap means of credentializing him, so that he can go on TV and say, "I'm an economist." And then after that, he spews all this anti-black garbage on their behalf that has nothing to do with economics whatsoever. That's it. His so-called economics degree might as well be toilet paper for all the good it's done him. Nobody takes Thomas Sowell seriously on matters of the economy. Nobody looks to him for any sort of sage advice. All he does is say, "I'm black, and I have an economics degree, so you can't say those racist white guys over there who pay me to say this stuff are racist because, well, reasons." These continued race-baiting stunts the white right is doing, this is what white fragility means. To be so ultra-hypersensitive due to one's knowledge of how their position in the world was truly attained that they don't dare speak the truth. But when black people speak up, these racists don't respond by giving facts, as I've just demonstrated. They instead respond with an avalanche of lies, hateful invective, and whataboutism. I've long told you that most manifestations of anger are actually rooted in fear. So when you see these white supremacists getting furious about the reality of race in America being talked about, the first question that's supposed to come to your mind is, what are these white supremacists scared of? Because anger is most often used as a way to cover one's fear. To admit to fear also means to admit to vulnerability, to being weak in the face of a threat. White supremacy can't do that. So it's far better to try to mask the fear behind an overcompensating front of anger instead. Which is why, from the race riots to this current performative extremism, where paid crisis actors working for right-wing think tanks and organizations go to school boards and pretend to be angry that history is being taught in school, this is what we're seeing, and this is why we're seeing it. It's like that old legal saying goes, if you have the law on your side, argue the law. If you have the facts on your side, argue the facts. But if you have neither on your side, pound the table. Racists and their mascots furiously screaming, "Our lies are true," doesn't make them facts. This is why the white right in particular has resorted to appealing to white emotionalism, because they don't have the law or the facts on their side. Why are so many white supremacists enraged at the prospect of having to hear the reality of race? Why do they immediately get furious when you point out the founders of the U.S. were slave owners? It's because those slave owners committed genocide against black people and deprived black people of their basic human freedoms and rights for centuries. These white supremacists directly benefited from that. That's the reason why it makes them angry for you to talk about it. They know that those same racist founders set up the American racial hierarchy, which is still in place and still feeding these white supremacists to the present day, and they can't defend it. It's also the reason that you see them going overboard with the lies about slavery and race. It's the reason performative extremism is so popular with them. It makes them furious to have to hear the truth about themselves and how they got their place in the world, how it's all based on racial goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that they could never have gotten on their own. Because they can't defend that either. What's happening in Florida is about teaching young people a false narrative about slavery. It's about white supremacist indoctrination. But it's also a desperate cry for help from the white right, who think that they're going to teach the country to try to preserve white privilege and postpone black empowerment by just lying their butts off. Well, they can try to rewrite the history books, but no one can rewrite reality, and they can't make us go along with it either. Because if they had the intellectual honesty and moral courage to face the facts, instead of pathetically trying to manufacture alternative facts, then they would know that history is littered with repressive regimes who thought that if a few small lies could get them into power, then telling a bunch of big lies would keep them in power forever. Well, as Desantis and that clown car of kooks, cranks, and crazies he surrounded himself with are slowly finding out, ideologues who fail the honesty test also tend to fail the longevity test too. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Keith B., Nicholas Moore, Nora Brown, Andrew Murphy, and Suleiman Alaji. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.